Well, we'd like to welcome everybody out to another Sunday afternoon class using local and state censuses for genealogical research. This is one of the areas that is probably the least used of the most usable records that I can think of. In other words, these are very, very good records to use for a lot of different purposes in genealogical research. And from that standpoint, they are probably the least used. And I have to say that I really, over the years have not focused on state censuses. And I kind of regret that now that I've gone back through and looked at a variety of different types of censuses that have occurred, some of which are quite surprising. So, kind of get into this. First of all, this is one of the very first document collections that new genealogists or family historians learn about. That's the census records. And in the United States, they are every 10 years, starting in 1790 up through the last 1950 census, which was released a couple of years ago. So what we have here is just an average census form. This particular one is from the 1940 census. So we have a lot of information here, and we'll get into that and look at some of this information more specifically. But I really have to say that this presentation will focus on census documents in the United States. And I just need to say there's similar documents in many other countries. Some countries have very extensive censuses like the UK, England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. There's census records that go back to 1841 with amazing detail. In fact, they're much more useful than they are in the United States because they require people to tell where they were born specifically. That alone makes a great difference in the information that's available. The idea here was to focus on records that were not the U.S. federal census records. So we're going to look at state and then down into local censuses. There are many state and local censuses that help to fill in the gaps and provide research opportunities. It's just something you need to know. And this particular census record is a 1979 to 1918 census records, and this one happens to be a census taken by the city of Alexandria, Virginia. It may be a little bit difficult to read and decipher, but this is the kind of record that perhaps has not been used as frequently as other records. One of the challenges of doing genealogical research has always been to locate the time and the date and the place of an event in an ancestor's life. We need to have specific information. We need a date, can be a little bit approximate, but when we talk about places, we need to know the specific place that the event occurred. The reason for that is very simple. All of the records that are created for genealogical purposes, particularly, and many of the other records in the world without even a mention of genealogy are records that are organized by location. It's just a convenient way to organize records, and it makes it convenient for genealogical research, except for in the situations where we don't know the place. And that happens quite frequently when we work backward in time to an immigrant and we don't know the place of origin of that immigrant. So one of the things that you can focus on initially here is that there are state censuses. Almost every state has at least one, and some have a whole bunch. And we'll go through and see a sort of an overview of all of these different censuses. But you can start, if you want to find out that information, is right here on the United States Census Bureau, where you can learn about state censuses and learn further about genealogical research with census records. So there's There's a lot of information because of their, let's say, obvious usefulness. The census records have been talked about many, many, many times. And it's important to understand this. The state censuses can be as important as the federal census. And sometimes they're only randomly taken and they're underutilized. So they can sometimes substitute for a missing federal census record. It's not unusual, I would say, from time to time, someone will come to me with the question and say, I just cannot find this person in the census records at all. And the question then, there's a lot of questions that I ask back, such as, do you know exactly where this person was living at some point in time when there would be a federal census? So in other words, if, for example, a child may be born in 1921 and die in 1929, and they won't show up in any census because they wouldn't be in the 1920 or the 1930 U.S. Census. But most notably, the censuses that are difficult are the 1790, 1800, and 1810 censuses, which are not as complete as subsequent censuses. It's also important to understand about census records is that even though they are supposed to be complete and accurate, they are neither complete nor accurate, completely accurate nor complete. Okay, so we need some kinds of backups to go beyond researching just on census records. Additionally, there's always the random mistakes by the enumerators, the people taking the census. And for years, before there were computers, before we had everything digitized, before I could look on digital records and we were looking for paper records, finding my grandfather in the 1920 census turned out to be almost impossible. And then it was only until there were computers and things began to be more visible and I could make more searches without going to a library to look at the records. And then I found out that they had misspelled his name. It's Tanner, but they had spelled it Tamer, and that's how it came up in the indexes at the time. So it's pretty hard to find Tanner if it's Tamer. Okay, so those are kinds of things that perhaps create a difficulty with the censuses. The biggest gap, of course, is the 1890 census, which was never made available, of course, for indexing or for any other purpose. There was a large fire, and part of the census records were lost. There's a long story on the Library of Congress about the census and some other records at the National Archives about the census. And if you want to read the whole story, it's a few pages long and it goes through a lot of detail. But essentially, what happened is no efforts were made to salvage the records that had survived the fire, and eventually, due to a lack of appropriation of funds by the Library of Congress, they were thrown away. So things do happen, and the records are gone. But now we can say, okay, in another state, if you're looking for a census record, how about looking for the state census record, or even further for a local census record? Okay, so here's a very interesting reference book written quite some time ago in 1992. One note about the publication: if I were reading articles, books about artificial intelligence, for example, the great changes that are going on right now, I wouldn't even want to read last week's news. If I were to read last week's news, they would have missed everything that changed in the last week and wouldn't be accurate or up to date. But let's get into realities of genealogy. A book that was published years ago about genealogical records is just as valuable today as it was when it was published. Because how did the historical records change? None of them changed. Now, what we're looking at here is a list of the years for state censuses in all of these states. And if you can look there, and Alaska has a lot of records. Georgia has a lot of census records. Iowa has maybe more than the other ones on the list. Delaware only has one state census, 1782. And Connecticut has no state census records that are known to exist. So maybe, and Idaho also has not done a state census. So we're into a situation where, yes, this may be valuable, but if your family happens to be from Connecticut, then you're not going to have to worry about a state census. And in Idaho, same problem. Now let's look at the whole list, and I'm just going to run through the list here real quick so you can kind of scroll through and see that there are a few states that don't have records, and then there are a lot of states with records. Now, assuming that this is correct, that there's no state census records known to exist in a state, the question is, are there any local censuses? Did any local state entity like a county or a township or a city have a census list of the people in their location? So here's another issue. Okay, so let's suppose now we think of some other records that may be helpful that work in the same way, perhaps with not as much information, but still may give us some information about our ancestors. Perhaps we're looking at city directories, and a city directory is very similar to a census because it gives us a lot of information about who lived where in the city. And what about phone books, telephone books? I know that probably very few of younger people here in the United States have ever even seen a phone book. It's been years since we've had a phone book. And so there are things like that have helped us along the years as with our research. Here's the deal. If you're looking for research in any U.S. state, until you started memorizing all this stuff and have looked at it enough times to realize that your state did not have any census records or that they have a lot of census records, then you need to automatically start checking for a state census. And this is an Alabama state census in 1855. It may be very helpful because you have the U.S. 1850 census and the U.S. 1860 census. This may pick up additional information that is not like a child born in a family that are perhaps not reflected in the other censuses. So this is an example of a census of that type. To get a basic understanding of the census records and where it is, it's always a good idea to start with the Family Search Research Wiki. There are well over 100,000 articles on here. There are a few that aren't kept up quite that needs to be. There's a lot of work that could be done with the Research Wiki, but the basic information that's here is not out of date, and it's obviously useful. Given what I just said earlier about the fact that books published in times in the past can be just as useful as they were if they were brand new, because there's no information more to give you or more information. There could be slightly different information, but not much. So what's in the collections? This is an Alabama state census page, and it tells the counties, it tells some of the information about the state. It goes into record types, what the records can tell you, and it tells you a lot of different other information that you may be looking for. Right down at the bottom, it's hard to see, I think, but you can see that the categories of information in this Alabama state census include those who are insane within each county, insane sent abroad. That's an interesting category. Slaves, now enslaved people, free persons of color and the total inhabitants. One of the things that you're going to need to know about this census in 1855 is look at the history of the counties that are listed here. Because the counties in 1855 in Alabama have probably changed. And in order to use that information, you need to focus on the history of the counties. And that history is fairly accessible. If you look up the history of any of the counties in the United States, you will find information, specific information about that county. And there's one large website from the Newberry Library in Chicago called the Atlas of Historical County Boundaries, which is probably one of the best resources for boundary changes and all of the information available about the changes in the county. They also have an interactive map of the whole United States where you can see the boundary changes on every county that ever was created from back in 1605 forward to the present. There's work that you have to do to fully utilize what you find in a census, any census record, whether it's the US Census or the state census. And that involves the boundaries of the entity, the jurisdictional entities that were available at the time of the census. So we need to know when the census date was. Then we need to know whether the county that we're looking in is the county that was in existence at the time that that census record was being taken. So this is kind of the information that we basically need to do what we're going to try to do, and that is understand where and how to get this information. The good news here on location of the records is that many of these collections, many of these state censuses are in the larger genealogy programs such as Family Search and Ancestry. Over in Europe, beginning with the UK, Find My Past has a really good selection of English, Scotland, and Wales census records, and others. This gives you an idea of how to get into the census. You have United States U.S. Census, then you go to Massachusetts, and then you go to the Massachusetts Census. So what's going to happen here is that you're going to see links to the federal censuses, but there's going to be online state and territorial censuses in addition to that. So in addition to the records that you're going to be using to find, this would be the way to quickly find what state and territorial census were available and what they contained. And it will tell you very quickly in this case that although there are other censuses that were conducted, there's only two surviving schedules. That means the records from 1865 and 1855. They also show that these records appear on Family Search and on Ancestry and are also in American Ancestors. And you have little dollar signs by Ancestry and American Ancestors for the reason that they have a paywall. We need to also to check whether or not a state census record has been indexed. Now, the whole issue of indexing is rapidly changing. I mean, changing day by day. Every day changes. And the reason for that is that any of these kinds of records, with like census records, are going to be used handwriting recognition to recognize the handwriting, transcribe the information in the census records, and then using computer-aided indexing, index those records so that can be searched by any of the categories at any time, back and forth, what we would call full text search. So having all of these resources indexed is no longer an issue so much, but currently we're in that transition and there may be no index for a specific record that's been maintained by Ancestry. Well, Ancestry would be different. Ancestry attempts to index all their records, and with their new AI, they probably are in the process of indexing everything they had left. But Family Search is still playing catch up with indexing, and it'll take a while before all the records on Family Search have been indexed by handwriting recognition and computer-aided indexing, which is CAI, computer-assisted indexing. So when we go back to that 1855 census, when we go on Family Search, we see there is an index to the census. And we will be able to do a search. Now, this may be the old index, meaning the index that was for names and places, or it may be the new index and be all of the information with the transcription. So you just need to keep working on Family Search because every day they're doing millions of new records, processing millions of records through this AI. So when you search for a specific name, remember that there may be many people with the same name. It's hard to put into words how important this is and understand. When I was young, very young, I didn't know anybody that had my name, obviously. And so I thought I had a kind of a unique name. Well, yes, no. And as a matter of fact, I was made aware of this when our family visited the Arlington National Cemetery outside of Washington, D.C. And the first thing I saw driving in was a huge headstone with the name James Tanner. I suddenly realized that probably there were lots of other people who have that name. As a matter of fact, we just looked up on a directory just in the last couple of days, and my wife was looking up something about me and looked, and there were about 10 people with my name just in the area here in Utah. This is kind of a reality, and the problem we get into, of course, is that if you make the conclusion that you have the same name, you have found the name, you found the person. The answer is it only is a person if that exists, if that is the exact place where that person lived. So if you look at these people listed here, John Evans, John Evans, John Evans, John P. Evans, and so forth, you'll see that there are lots of very specific places: Pickensville, Alabama; Macon, Alabama; Tuscaloosa, Alabama; Sumter, Jefferson, Alabama. There's lots of places where these people lived. And if you're focusing on the place, then you have difficulty in separating out or ruling out all these people as the wrong person. So we always start with the specific place where your ancestor lived. I cannot say this enough times, and I will continue to say it frequently. So even though these records show tick marks, there's a lot of information. That means those little slashes out there that give you the numbers of people in each column. So if you know the columns, then you're going to be able to reconstruct the family as having so many adults and so many children. And in this case, how many people were African American, how many people were white, and so forth. And so even though they're only tick marks, you can see the people who are probably related, because if you zoom in on this, you'll see that in this one little place, there were 3 Delaney families: an MR, and there's a BF, and there's an FH. And so this may give us more information that we had previously about our family living in that particular location. And we may have some leads on additional names of people when we have the initials of their name and surname. And one thing to always remember with Family Search is that there may be additional records in the images selection. Now, the images section of Family Search has been compiled because of the lag between the time the records were digitized and the time the records were able to be cataloged and indexed. And so as we get into the handwriting recognition and full text searches, that difference is going to disappear. And so there's a question, of course, if these records are going to start vanishing out of the images and start showing up in the catalog. That's apparently what's happening, although I haven't heard the exact process yet of how they're going from the raw data here in the images into the records. But you can see here from this Alabama search that there were a lot of census records added here, images of the census records that may not have been available previously and may not be available yet in the other records that are already on Family Search. So that's that box of census records. There is also important to watch for new records that are being indexed and put into the familysearch.org/labs website. That's where the lab experiment of full text search is taking place. And this is another search for records for Alabama. And what this shows are records at various states that have been run through the full text search and are available for full text search. They may be complete, they may be incomplete in each of the categories, but these are the ones that are being processed. So watching this is a way to get an idea, and making searches in here may also add records that have been completely ignored in the past. Not ignored, but not really available due to the fact that you'd have to search so much to get there. So give you an example of what I'm saying. The first one there is Alabama wills and deeds. There's now 2.2 million plus records, and maybe a lot more since the 23rd of December. And when we originally had the records, the only way to get into that set of records was to know a specific location and maybe an approximate date or maybe the date of death. But a probate isn't filed exactly on the date of death. So a death date gives you only a suggestion of the date of the probate. The probate could have been filed a month, 2 months, 6 months, a year, or more later after the death of a person. It's not uncommon to have that kind of a gap between the date of death and the actual probate. There are lots of reasons for that, and they're just extensive possibilities. So finding a record in a will file without an index can be almost more than anybody wants to do, because you would have to go through each record for each year and see if your person was there. Now, the possibility exists that there was an index created by the court that was doing the wills. And so they would be then looking for those index may be the name of the testator or the person who died without a will or the administrator. So those wills kinds of things may be there in the digital record that can help you kind of zoom in on a record. But what happens if your person is the heir of a will? And that's the information that you need to know. That doesn't fall into the court's index records. They just don't index that deeply. And so you're going to be set up with not being able to find that record unless you spend a considerable more time than most of us want to do looking at record after record and reading the entire record to see if the record's there. Now, in the past, in the dark past of the prehistory of genealogical research, that's what we did. And that's what I did. And on many occasions when I was doing my first set of research was to sit in the family search library now, or family history library as it was then, and go page by page through, in that case, Rhode Island town records, and spending weeks going through the records trying to put together my Tanner family. This is a major, major, major advancement where we can now do name searches, say, place searches, all sorts of things, and come up with a variety of records. And the research response may be great. So here's another list of state census records. You have all the listings of census records as they have been cataloged by, this is Family Search, as they have been cataloged by Family Search. And so if we look closely, we'll see that there are records that are years other than the 10-year census. And now this indicates that these are censuses that are not part of the federal census. There are other censuses. So there's one in 36, 38, 40. There isn't that much more detail here about those censuses until you get into looking at an individual census. Here's a census of 1902. It's actually from 1901 to 1902 for the Rice Lake Band of the Chippewa Indians in Lac du Flambeau and La Pointe Agency in Wisconsin. Okay, so having done a considerable amount of research and a lot of research on Native Americans, it was interesting to me to run across this kind of record. In other words, this is a record of some Native Americans that is not in the federal census. And it may not be something that even if you were looking for Chippewa Indians, you would know existed until you got into looking for census records for the Chippewa Indians. And maybe it wouldn't have occurred to you that anyone had done a census for the Chippewa. So this is the kind of almost impossible to imagine type of record that occurred. And as you get into it, and this is again in the catalog, this is, I'm not sure I think I'm still in the old catalog. So one of the other things that's happened very recently from whenever this is posted online, this presentation in the last couple of weeks has been that there is a new catalog replacing this old catalog that is now updated. The old catalog, which this is a part of, is basically was about more than 2 years behind and not being updated. Now there's a new catalog coming out, and it's just popping up because it's being distributed sort of in different areas by Family Search, and it's not uniform. And so at the BYU library, where we have a lot of computers, you can go from one computer to another and see the old catalog and the new catalog and then the old catalog. So it may take a couple of more weeks or months to get everything onto all of the new catalog and all of the different parts of the Family Search. But basically, this catalog shows that when I looked at the subject of the censuses of the Chippewa, I found there's a lot more information. There's information about other tribes. There's different bands of the Chippewa. And it's just, you just have to understand that these census records were not federal census in a sense. They were Wisconsin census, but some of those were BIA or Bureau of Indian Affairs records, and they wouldn't be considered to be census records in the sense of U.S. Census records. So looking for these records is going to be different than simply looking for records like records that you would look for, like just go out and look for census. Now, what I would suggest, however, is doing census search, and I'll say this, explain that a little bit more. In other words, searching just for censuses. And the question here that I would ask is, how would you know about this very local census unless you were looking for it? And how would you know to look for it before you found it? And so, in other words, these are the kinds of records that are not, you're not going to find a lot of online stuff about these records and people talking about them a lot because they're very narrow and they're very focused, and they happen to be in Chippewa. And so it may be a little bit difficult to understand the difference between the people. So when we get down to this, we find that there are going to be the same kinds of very, very local, very focused census records that we may not have looked at. Now, why would they have been taken? They could have been taken for tax purposes. They could have been taken for the fact that BIA wanted to keep track of the Native Americans. They may have wanted to have been whatever it was. And so we don't know without doing the research that these records exist. Now, here's an interesting. This is another thing that you may need to know, and that is don't believe what you find in the family. Don't necessarily believe it. You need to look for it in the Family Search Research Wiki. It is extremely reliable on the general. But when you get down to specific information about the existence of records and what is and what is not in the Research Wiki, although it is a fabulous resource and has tremendous amount of information, it doesn't have everything. And over the years, because of the maintenance, it may not have everything. So, and this is the case. These are the same records that I was looking at just a moment ago, the list of records. And they're all saying those records are Wisconsin Historical Society when they're on Family Search. So always make sure you're doing general searches on the big websites and very specific searches. And over time, especially on the bigger websites like Family Search and MyHeritage and Find My Past and Ancestry, you're going to find them using AI more and more, and your searches will be more specific and more productive over time. So these are going to be due. But overall, out on the internet, you need to be aware of the fact that doing searches is important to get the records there too. Let's kind of move along here. There's another possibility, and that is Wisconsin Territorial Census for 1846. That means before it became a state. And there's the copy of the record that I found, and I made the note that I found this in the new catalog. So this was a record that may have been transcribed at the time. Once we start looking in the records section also, you may find that there are already indexed records. So here's the Wisconsin State Census for 1905, and it's a name index and images. Now we get into local censuses. And in this case, this is a number of records. These all come from Family Search of the New York City censuses for different times. You can see they correspond in most cases with the federal census, which means that they're just parts of the federal census. But when you get down to the bottom, you get the 1855 censuses, and those are not part of the federal census. And they may be, in this case, limited to one voting ward in New York City. This census shows up in a search online. It's the 1813 census, but everybody kind of acknowledges that it's missing. And the answer is, why do we have a copy of one page of the 1813 census if it's missing? But there may be more research that needs to be done here, but that may be the case with other census records in other parts of the country. This is another one. In 1864, there was a territorial census in Arizona. Why is the 1864 date significant in Arizona? It's because it is kind of the earliest date that you're going to find very many, let's call them other than prospectors, army people who were there, and a lot of Spanish speaking population in the south part of the state. So an 1864 census may show information about the early settlement of Arizona that you would not be able to find otherwise. And the other thing you're noticing about these is these census indexes and census records are compiled by people. These are in books. They're not in a file that was created. There's an actual book. And here's the unexpected. So here's a pre-territorial Primaria Alta 1852 census, and it's a book, and it was published in 1986 by the Arizona State Genealogical Society. And so these are very, very interesting and can be very valuable books to look for. And once you get into that category of books, you would probably do well to check with worldcat.org. WorldCat will give you a list of what's in the libraries. It's the catalog of the library's catalog. So looking up this Mexican census back in that's in a book format, we see that there's a copy in the Family Search Library and 5 other libraries. If you have a library near you, you can go in and use interlibrary loan to go look at a book like this and use their request of the other library. And it helps to be able to tell them that, yes, you already know that there is a copy at ASU or whatever. Now, it may be that the record is only available at one single library or archive. Some of these documents may be so, let's call it uncirculated, uncopied, undigitized kind of records that are just sitting in a pile of records at some archive. Those are the kinds of things that you may find in other locations and you may not. One time I was searching for a book and found that there was only one copy of the book, and it was in a library in someplace in Florida. And that when I contacted the library, they said no, it was not available for circulation, even on interlibrary loan. So we may just have to take a trip if we really want to see that particular source. And one other thing is when you do a search, this is in the books section of Family Search for books, just look for census. And my keywords were Georgia State Census records, and we came up with a census, the 102 pages of the Carroll County, Georgia census back in 1850. Now, granted, there was a U.S. census in 1850, but the question would be, why is there this book? Is this a copy of the federal census, or is this an additional census, or is there information here that may not be in the other census? So the magic word to search for out there in any country, any place, going even beyond the boundaries of the United States for sure, the word to use is search for census. Now, you might have to translate it into all the different languages in order to get a good search, but basically, you're going to find that census records are something that may or may not be available. Now, for an example, if you look for Australian national records from Australia, and you want to look at the census records, you're going to find out something pretty quickly, and that is there aren't any because Australia does not keep or circulate their records after they take the census. Okay, so there's places where you may not have as much advantage as others. The idea here, and what is really important, is to keep searching. Keep looking for things that you are imagining might be out there. census directory, listings, phone books, anything that you can think of that might have names and might tell you something about your person or place are going to be things. I have walked into libraries just randomly all over the country and walked on the shelves and to see what kinds of things they had. I have pulled things off the shelf and looked at things that I had never imagined having been in the library. And I think that it's important that we understand in genealogy, there's a rule that one of the basic rules is there are always more records. Now, there are limitations on that. There aren't always more records in the absolute sense, but there are always more records as long as you are searching within, let's say, the last 2 to 500 years. Okay, well, thanks for watching, and let's see if we have any questions. Looks like we have a few. The Research Wiki is on Family Search under the Search tab. It's on, just go to the Search tab on every page. The Labs full text search is exactly what I wrote, and that's familysearch.org/labs, LABS. That's the link to the labs. And you'll have to sign into Family Search to get there. Are there 1890 censuses? Not necessarily 1890 censuses to fill the gaps for the lost of the U.S. Census. There may be an 1850 or 60 census. There's lots of different possibilities for censuses out of that long list, but it depends obviously on whether or not the state had a state census. Some counties have great registers for 1890, which fill in the gap, their voter registration records. Well, there's lots of other similar records that are available. I mentioned directories, I mentioned phone books. I didn't mention every type of record. There's tax records, there's real estate records, there's all different kinds of records that fill in the gaps, but we just don't want to ignore the obvious, which are the state census and the local census records.